Hello Biblionauts, I am Grix and many other things. I am bringing you today to not reconstruction, but I'm just following from a video I made a few days ago about Val Plumwood and the Mastery of Nature. You don't need to watch that video, although I'll link it in the description. But it's basically thoughts on ecology and things like anthropocentrism and so on. Val Plumwood presented like a very pessimistic idea about the way we think and how it's always in contraposition, and how that contraposition always has like an active and a passive side, and how the West has always through that contraposition kind of like had like an antithetic approach to the natural world. Also in a sense of simplification, you have always a mentality of black and white in that sense. But my main problem with Plumwood is that she was ignoring other writers like Schelling, but just writers in general that did not think on these terms. And also that there was a lot of generalism, and at the end I didn't feel like her proposal of multiplicity really amount to a true solution. I'm not sure that we can escape anthropocentrism, and I'm also not sure that dualism is something that we can escape. However, today I'm bringing you two possible answers to that. On the one hand, we have Diderot's dialogue, Allenbert's Stream, which is I consider dialogues to be the best form of philosophical thought, because they are just in the right place in between literature and philosophy. When it goes too far on the academic side, it becomes like fire without a fuel. It doesn't really get through the paper. It's completely dry. The prose is unnecessarily painful to read, but also it kind of loses its grasp with the world, and philosophy should always be applied to something in the world. Otherwise, it's not theology, but kind of. And on the other side, if you go too far on the literary side, you start focusing more on the form than on the content. And not necessarily, because there are some great writers that are able to do both, but the further you focus on the form, the less you focus on the content, the less weight your points are going to have, even if your prose is more beautiful. I feel like dialogues are right on the right spot. And this is a wonderful dialogue. Actually, it's a series of 3 dialogues, but I'm especially interested here in the part that talks about multiplicity in nature and multi-organisms, very sort of like on a pretty much Lynn Margulis kind of vein. But before this, I also want to consider the golden rule. Stephen Jay Gould, his thoughts on appropriate scale for our environmental crisis. It's a text that he wrote criticizing the idea of anthropocentrism and the idea of an Anthropocene. Ecologists in the last few years, it's not been that long, is pretty much a recent term that has sort of exploded in the academic world in the 20th century, have created this concept of the Anthropocene as the moment in which humans started impacting the world on a geological scale. And of course, this, apart from involving geologists into the world of philosophy, which is always good to have some interdisciplinary conversation, there should always be an interdisciplinary conversation when it comes to philosophy. Philosophers talking to philosophers is the most boring thing that you could imagine. If there is nothing else but philosophy to talk about, they normally call them metaphysicists. But yeah, I am interested in this concept. I am interested in both Jay Gould's perspective, his critique, and how he kind of like ends up at the end of the text falling in the same things that he's trying to criticize. Perhaps because the train of thought that with which he is criticizing the intrinsic anthropocentrism, the intrinsic ego of the idea of an Anthropocene, I think he was a geologist, and he does not believe that humanity can have an impact on a geological scale. And the idea that, using that as a way to alert people that we are kind of destroying the planet, and therefore we should be careful, because it's not us, but it's the planet that we are destroying. Brings back this idea of like Stewart, like we are the protectors of the planet. We have to save the planet. It's been said over and over and over that we just need to save us. There's the only cool stand-up comedy that Jim Jeffries ever made. He says this in the first few minutes, and that's the only stand-up that he's ever made that's funny or anything. But that one I do recommend. It's the first special he had in Netflix. But before him, many other people said that, and I think it's if you look at time on a geological scale, we're talking about millions of years. It's obvious that our presence in this planet, which is, as he says at some point, a microsecond, does not have a geological impact. We are only within that microsecond able to see our prints within our own ephemerity. But that's not something that's going to outlast us. Not only that, but the whole concept, the whole idea of a million years is something that we cannot even really cognize. We can conceptualize it. We can think. I think Bertrand Russell has a nice text in which he differentiates between sort of like one thing and the other. You can think of a geometrical figure of 1,000 faces, of 1,000 sides or angles, but you cannot imagine it. It's beyond what you can conceive. So to even think that we would have any impact millions of years from now on the planet, that we would still be traceable as a major event, so major that there would be a whole era, a geological era for our passing through this planet, is another exercise of this arrogance, this humanistic, self-centered arrogance that we have as a species. And he has a problem with that, and he criticizes that, especially coming from environmentalists, which are supposed to. Environmentalism is supposed to kind of bring us down to the earth and be like, this is reality and this is what's going to happen. But at the end of the day, they fall on the same dynamics, on the same thoughts that put humans in the center of the world. That's kind of what Stephen Jay Gould says. And then he says that we should escape from this reasoning, from this form of reasoning. But the problem is that his critique kind of gets trapped on it's a bit circular, because if by adding humility by adding some not only epistemological but existential humility as a species into the picture, what he ends up he ends up kind of retreating into the golden rule, into the idea of the oldest of all moral axioms. Treat thy neighbor as you would like to be treated, or however it translates into English language. But you know what I'm talking about. Which is the most human of all axioms. So basically what he is saying is that in order to avoid anthropocentrism, in order to avoid the ego of believing that we can have any impact beyond the human, we need to retreat back into the human with the, I guess, awareness that we are retreating to the human. But I feel like what happened is that at some point, while writing the text, the ideas were like, there were two paths that converged in a yellow good, and one of them took him to a safe place where he could think and frame his ideas on a familiar ground, and the other one was too radical, and he avoided the radical path because the other answer would have been that we need to create a new way of thinking, a new framework, a new way of approaching the natural world that gives way to the natural world, that allows the natural world to present itself as it is, without without logic, without the linguistic or intellectual loops or mechanisms of human perspective, which is but the reason why he did not take this is because he, at the end of the day, he was criticizing this arrogance, the arrogance that we can not only be anything but go beyond the human. And I am inclined to agree that we cannot go beyond the human, that we can only ever be anthropocentric. But I think there's a scale. I think that going back to the golden rule is a bit of a complacent way to end the text. I feel like it's perhaps he just didn't know where to go and went to get it done, or didn't want to end up with a more perhaps polemic tone. But that's kind of his conclusion. Now, that to a degree falls into what Plumwood was criticizing in the video I made a few days ago, in the sense that it does once again not escape the forms of thinking that we've been using for millennia. Of course, you could say that we've been using them for millennia for a reason, and you wouldn't be wrong. But the answer is we are at a critical time in the human history. The time is, I don't believe that there is any possibility of not only political change or social conciliation, but I don't believe that there is any possibility of reverting the inevitable and approaching and already here consequences of our not only neglecting but also exploiting nature, of our actions as a species in a planet that did not belong to us, and we did treat it as if it did. Just a few days ago, Steve was making a video about newspapers articles, and one of them was about how women can save the planet, and he used a word that I found very just right, which is mitigation. That's all we can think about, and that's insofar as we are concerned with our own comforts. We can only mitigate the consequences of a long history of careless exploitation of the natural world. That is insofar as we are concerned with the political, with the actual field work, with the actual reality of our day-to-day life. Now, in the philosophical world, there is still a space for, can we think of nature in a different way? Can we escape the narratives of the human mind? Can we stop dualism? Can we suspend dualism? And I thought that dialogues in this dialogue in specific is much more successful at speaking about nature and speaking about things like evolution and symbiosis in a way that feels at least way less subject to some of those narratives of mastership of nature or master-slave dialectics or anything like that. So I'll read you like one of the very first paragraphs in the second page, or not in the second page in this document, because this document is not the full text. It starts on page 108, which is the story on the middle. I'm skipping the first story and the last one. The dialogue in the middle. And I'll just read you this out of context. Well, and by the way, it's not properly printed, so I'm kind of struggling to decipher what I read it on the computer, but the Kindle is easier to hold, so I'll just go from there. Well, listen, a living point. No, that's no wait, that's okay. A living, yes, here, a living point. No, that's wrong. Nothing at first, then a living point. Another living point. Here he's talking about life. How does life emerge? Another living point itself onto the first one, then another. From a series of such additions, there results a living being. For I myself am just such a being. How can I doubt? How can I doubt that? As he said this, he touched various parts of himself, but how did such a unified being come into existence? yeah, that the rest is them sending him to sleep, basically, and then comes back and talks about a dream of swarm and bees and further thoughts on like multiplicity and the idea of life, every single human organism, not a human, every single organism being sort of like a hive, cohesive whole formed by specific individual units of life. This is nothing new. Of course, this is philosophizing about interesting mixture between what we know about what Diderot knew on his time about evolution and what Lee Margulis would continue to develop. I say Lee Margulis because I know her as the most prominent figure of ideas of symbiosis and cooperation and cooperative organisms within living bodies. And I'm not super well read on the subject, so I just use her as an ambassador for all the other authors that I know came before her who also talked about these ideas. But what I like about this text and about this specific part and the further thoughts about the further idea of the dream that one of the characters comes back from and talks about, and the idea of the swarm and the bees, is that first of all it escapes narratives that in the time were very much and still today are pretty much hegemonic of competition, master slave, winner loser, and almost like evolution had some sort of morality behind it. I wonder if you think that evolution has a moral strife in the sense of like, life itself evolving towards the strongest, most successful individual intentionally. There's two ways to look at it, right? On the one hand, you have like the unicellular life forms that unite themselves into a more complex life. You could use a spermatozoid and an ovule. I don't know how you say the female the female gamete. Ovule, I don't know the word in English, but in the sense of like reproduction, you get two cells, and from those two cells you get a whole organism that has thousands, millions of them. Is there an intentionality within this individual cells? Is there an intentionality in nature in a grander scale, or in a swarm, in a beehive? Is there an intentionality in every individual bee to create a whole hive, to create a whole colony? And is there any individual that is indisposable? If no individual is indisposable, and if there is no intentionality, then the unity is not necessarily randomized, because if it were randomized, then we wouldn't have the order or the harmony that we have in the world. If it were randomized, life would appear in every single possible form, right? We could also separate sort of like the ever-changing, ever-generating impulse of life. Life is sort of like life is not a thing like the Spinoza's nature, right? Life is pretty much a machinery. It's a wheel that keeps turning. Is constant change. Is the generation and regeneration of new forms of life that themselves evolve into more complex life, that itself evolves into more complex and more intricate life, that does not seem to have a telos. Doesn't seem to be a teleological thing, other than it does not seem to be a teleological thing because life involves death, right? We don't evolve in order to live forever. We evolve in order to die, and then that through that cycle to come back again as a new form of life. So, I mean, this is just thoughts up here. But I don't see how it would be into the program, into this mechanism of ever emerging new life and ever increasing complexity, the idea of avoiding death or the idea of good and evil or anything like that, which is to say that the fact that certain forms of life survive and others don't is not randomized, but it's not determined by life itself. It's determined by the natural world. It's determined by not the natural world even, but like the playground of life, the conditions of the ecosystem, which are completely separate. It's sort of like the sterile and the biological, if you will. So is there a separation? Or when you think of nature, you think of the whole, including those parts that completely lack life? Is there a division between life that is in the sense of being, in the sense of conjugating the verb, in the sense of existing, in the sense of having a certain motion, or maybe you will give me a psychopantheist view and think that everything in some way is alive, or is it which one is it? I don't know. I'm kind of just putting ideas forward, and what I like about this text is precisely that it does not look for what is the man behind the whole thing, or what is the value behind all of this, right? It's not trying. Is exploring. Is exploring these ideas without necessarily explaining them, without adding the human aspect. Like, I mean, I feel like Darwin does that to a degree, and does that in the sense of like he's framing it throughout he frames his theory of evolution through the argumentative tools and the values of his time. And he was a very Christian man, and it does in some ways come across in the text. At least to me, I did read The Origin of Species, and to me, the idea of competition is something that could only, I think of it as something that could only have been written by a certain kind of person to begin with, probably a male, and that is not to say that his ideas didn't transcend it and did not explain natural world. I do think that what Darwin wrote is the most revolutionary text ever written. But what I mean is that there are many ways in which you can explain things without adding the anthropocentric mentality into it. And I feel like when we talk about these dynamics and suddenly use words like competition that have like a moral weight to them, we necessarily are anthropomorphizing the natural world. There is no such a thing as competition. There is no such a thing as one individual and another individual fighting each other in this war of survival. There's a lot of poetic stuff like that in Descent of Man, and it's much more like, in that sense, no individual is aware of the whole. Just like in a state, very rarely do you get an individual that is aware of their role within the major organism that is being created. You could expand that into other forms of complexity that are also created by individuals that are not necessarily biological. So those are my thoughts. I wanted to present sort of like Diderot's dialogue and Berlet's dream as a recommendation. But I'm more interested in your ideas about ecology in general. Do you think that if you read Amberle's dialogue, do you think that the more mediated voyeuristic aspect of how nature is treated is a problem? Or do you like the dialogue? Did you feel like, because it's a bit simplified into an individual experience, is just as anthropomorphic as any other? When it comes to the writings about ecology and about the natural world, I value epistemological humility, the cognitive humility, more than in any other kind of writing. Insofar as we are talking about philosophy and about just thinking in general, I feel like it's different from when we are doing science and we are inhabiting a framework, and there's no question in there. So since this is not what I am trying to do here is not science, it's just thinking. I am wondering if you see any flaws in this form of thinking. Do you consider it to be more limited by its by the margins of its biped framework or not. Is it possible to think the natural in non-human terms? And also, if it is possible, has anyone done it? Do you have any examples of alternative forms of thinking that do you feel much closer to what nature, to how the natural world will be experienced by a non-human form of life or by life itself? Of course, again, that would make us fall back into the arrogance and the egocentrism of anthropocentrism. But there are certainly certain schools of thought or practices that proclaim to a degree to achieve certain kind of objectivity, as in the sense of alienation of the subject. I'm thinking of two very different ones, but in some ways related. One is phenomenology in the philosophical world, and in a more mystical sense, you have a Sazen, the Buddhist practice. There are many ways to explain Sazen. There are many ways to think about it. I know a couple of friends of mine that would cut my balls for defining it in this way, because they would completely disagree. But a way to think about Sazen is the alienation of the self and the complete experimentation of the world without the use of instrumental reason, just pure presence with absolute purposelessness. Is that a way of approaching the natural world? If it is, then is it useful at all? Because I don't know if you've read or heard any Zen master speak, but they speak nonsense. They have nothing to say. They're very vocal about this. They have nothing to say, and the whole point of Sazen is to say and do nothing. There is no goal. There is, the moment you annulate this telos, this goal, there is nothing, an empty vessel. I definitely do not want to be an empty vessel in my life. I have eternity for that, but I do consider it to be an interesting practice when it comes to teasing with the non-human, when it comes to flirting with other worlds. And yeah, I wrote anything else here that I want to remember. Again, remember, tell me if you think that evolution has a telos, if evolution has any value of any kind. Is nature's motion its real goal? I think it is. I think that the motion of life is life itself. It's more a pattern than a state, and in that sense I am anti-Rousseauian, although I do have a lot of sympathy for Rousseau, unlike most people. So yeah, I think I'll leave it here. This is a talk about life and death in human and non-human existence, and I'd like it to be continued on the comments. Let me know if you know of any book or any text that does some of the things that I've been talking about here, or attempts to do them, even if it fails, but it's interesting anyways. And I'll check them out, because yeah, this is what I'm thinking about at the moment. I'm writing stuff that is very related to this, much more than to Adorno. I did say that I was writing a book that was related to Adorno's ideas of enchantment and disenchantment, but it's a lot more related to nature and ecology. And I'm just getting started with that. So all ideas, all comments, all thoughts are welcome. I'll link in the description my other video about Val Plumwood, and why not, I'll link also Steve's video about some articles in a newspaper that does have some comments that I address here about ecology and are we doomed? Yes, we are doomed. Our comforts are doomed, that's for sure. I agree with that. But what about our capacity to still grasp an aspect of the natural world that we've been perhaps as a species, not necessarily individual, in an individual case-to-case scenarios, but as a species completely not only neglecting but pretty much alienating and demolishing systematically. So yeah, any thoughts? Anything at all? Let me know down there. I'll see you on the other side. Thank you, Uktuf. Now I gotta take a plane. Bye.